All right, guys, so we're going to do Chapter 7 now, which in your textbook is page 215, Easements, Restrictions, and Rights of Adjoining Owners. So I always find it easiest when I go over this chapter to draw a little diagram on the board and kind of label things and to explain the basics of what an easement is. Before I put that diagram up here, just to define generally what an easement is, the definition of an easement, it's a right that one property owner has the land of another. So I'm going to draw an example up here, but the first thing to know is just the general definition. An easement is a right that one property owner has the land of another. So I'll draw an example up here now. So let's say, for example, in this example that I have up here on the board, we have property A, we have property B. Property B is an oceanfront property, as indicated by these beautiful waves right here. And property A is the property that fronts the street. So again, B is the oceanfront property, and A is the one that's on the highway. Well, the owner of property A tells the owner of property B, listen, I would prefer not to have to walk all the way down the block to get up to the beach. I would much prefer to just cut right here through your property. Would you be willing to grant me an easement to cut through your property? Now, in real life, B will just say, hey, go ahead and walk through my property. But for test purposes, B says, yeah, you can cut through my property. I'll grant you an easement. Now, when B grants A an easement to cross over their property to get to the beach here, rather than walk around the block, by B granting that to A, who benefits from that? Well, obviously, A benefits from that because they're now allowed to cross over B's property to get to the beach, rather than having to walk around the block. So A, in this circumstance, we call the dominant premise. The dominant premise is the premises who is benefited from the easement. So A, we call the dominant premises. And B is the party that's burdened from this easement. We call them the servient premises. So B, we would call the servient premises. So again, A, the dominant premises, they are benefiting from this easement, and B, the servient premises, they're the ones who are burdened by the easement here. Now, after A grants the easement to, after B grants the easement to A to cross over their property like this to get to the beach, after they've granted that, if things aren't working out, unfortunately, there's nothing that they can do about that, because the only party that can revoke an easement is only the dominant premise. So if they were to ask you who's the only party that can revoke an easement, only the dominant premise can. So now you can grant this easement for a period of time for, let's say, 10 years, and after 10 years it would be done. But if you don't put a time limit on that, that could last forever. And easements are not granted to individuals. They're granted through the property. Easements, we say, are appurtenances. What an appurtenance means, it means that runs with the land or continues with the land. So when property owner B grants property owner A the right to cross over their property to get to the beach, they're not granting it to the owner, they're granting it to the property. So now, if A sells, and they sell to the worst neighbor of all time, a mean, disrespectful, nasty neighbor, B unfortunately has to, basically recognize this easement and still allow that new neighbor who's awful and they, really just disrespectful and mean to keep crossing over their property to get to the beach. Why? Because easements are said to be appurtenances, which means that they run with the land and they continue along with the land. With that being said, there is an alternative to the easement where you can just grant the individual the right to cross over your property to get to the beach. And the alternative to the easement is called the license. When you grant the license, what you're granting is you're granting personal and non-assignable permission to do something. So now, let's say the owner of property B is John Smith, and the owner of property A is Jane Doe. John says, listen, Jane's a great neighbor. They're very nice people, very respectful people. Jane, I don't want to grant you an easement because God forbid something happens to you, then I might have to deal with a bad neighbor, but I'll grant you a license. It's going to be personal and non-assignable permission for you and your family to cross my property. So this way, once you sell, that would end at that point in time. It wouldn't continue along with the land like an easement that is deemed to be an appurtenance. Think about it this way. It's like a driver's license, right? So if you have a driver's license to drive a car, that's permission for just you and you only to drive the car. I can't hand my license off to my friend and say, all right, you could drive now. Again, licenses, they are personal and non-assignable permission to do something. Now there's also a unique type of easement, and this unique type of easement is called a gross easement. And what's unique about it is that in a gross easement, there's only a servient and no dominant premise. It's the most common type of easement. It's an easement that you see every single day that you probably have on your own property, but you don't recognize it. So telephone poles, gas lines, sewer pipes, these are gross easements. These are forms of gross easements. So meaning that when that telephone pole is put down on your property, it's not like your neighbor put it there and they're the ones benefiting from it and things like that. Nobody's crossing over the property necessarily, but that's an example of a gross easement, a type of easement where there's only a servient premise and no dominant premise. So good example of that is just a general utility easement. So again, gas lines, sewer pipes, telephone poles, things like that. So just generally speaking, a gross easement is a special type of easement where there's only a servient and no dominant premise. And also on the first page here of 215, on the right side, it talks about ways you could create this easement. So it talks about express grant or express reservation. A grant is as simple as this. B grants A an easement. That's simple. Or, let's say express reservation. At one point in time, let's pretend this is all one property. And the guy who owns property A decided to subdivide it, chop it into two. And he said, you know what, I'm going to sell the oceanfront property because I'll be able to get a lot more money for that than the property that fronts the Route 35 here or something like that. But what I'm going to do, I'm essentially going to give myself oceanfront access because I'm going to reserve myself an easement to cross over B's property to get up to the beach here. So you could create it through what we call express reservation, which means just, reserving yourself the right to do something. So that's another way that you could create it there too. Next here, bottom right talks about implied grant or an implied reservation. Where would you have an implied easement? You would have an implied easement with a shared driveway. If we have a shared driveway that's just wide enough to fit a car, and it's shared between myself and my neighbor next to me, it's implied that we can briefly cross your property line with our car to get to the back half of our property where we park, as an example. So that would be a good example of an implied easement. So an implied easement, good example, that's a shared driveway. If you turn the page and go to page 216, talks about prescription. We'll talk about that more in the adverse possession chapter, but if they were to say an easement by prescription, that's any time that you really acquire property through adverse possession. Don't worry about that too much for this chapter. We'll go over that in chapter 13, where we talk about adverse possession. We have a whole chapter on that. Same goes for condemnation, also in chapter 13, whole chapter on that. We're not going to spend much time on that now. Bottom left of 216, an easement by necessity. When would you have an easement by necessity? Well, you would have it when it's absolutely necessary. And what would a situation like that be? That would be if for some reason they allowed you to subdivide a property into a tic-tac-toe board. So, like this. So if you're the owner stuck in the middle, it's absolutely necessary that you would have an easement to get out of your property. If you didn't have that easement, you would be landlocked. So an easement by necessity, that is created when somebody is landlocked. And then next here, if we go towards the top right of page 216, talks about a dedication. A dedication is a gift of property to the government. So if you were to gift property to the government, it's referred to as a dedication. Now, when you do give property to the government, you can gift them anything. You can gift them an easement or gift them an entire property. When you give property to the government, do they have to accept it? The answer is no, and this is something that we'll talk about more in chapter 12, where you would have to have voluntary delivery and acceptance, because maybe what you're trying to dedicate them is a contaminated property that you don't want to deal with. Well, they're not obligated to accept that. So a dedication, simply put, is a gift of property to the government, and it's at their discretion of whether or not they'd like to accept it. And then next here, bottom right of 216, talks about terminations of an easement. So how would you terminate an easement? The first example here is express release. Express just means in writing, and we already talked earlier about who could release an easement. So who could release an easement here? Either the dominant or the servient premise, right? So who is it? The dominant party. Only the dominant party can release the easement. So when they say express release, it means a release put in writing. The only party that can release the easement is just the dominant premise. And then we have merger. If these two lots merge, is there any reason to have an easement between the two anymore? No, there's not. So if the two properties merge, that would end the easement because there's no reason to have an easement anymore because it's all one property. And then talks about abandonment. So one thing I want to make sure I definitely point out is that just non-use of an easement for a long period of time won't cancel an easement. So, for example, if as the owner of property A, I don't go down the shore between the months of October and April. So therefore, when crossing over property B, I don't do that for 6 months. That's not going to cancel my easement. So just non-use of an easement for a long period of time, that won't cancel an easement. What will cancel an easement is a clear showing of you abandoning that easement. So let's say hypothetically you get a railroad easement, and it's to put a railroad track that leads from your factory to the main line, and your factory produces widgets. And these widgets you want to put on a boxcar, and you want to ship those out to the main line from your private railroad track. And then this isn't a publicly traveled railroad track, it's just one that you hook a boxcar up to and ship out to the main line. You shut down that factory, you rip up those railroad tracks and scrap them. That's a clear showing of abandonment. I've completely and totally abandoned that easement. Not only have I knocked down my factory, I've ripped up the tracks for the railroad easement. That's a clear showing of abandonment. So abandonment will cancel an easement. Just non-use for a long period of time will not, though. And then the bottom right here of 216 talks about terms of the instrument that created the easement. So give you an example of that by terms of the instrument that created the easement. If I have an easement that says this thing's good for 10 months, well, after 10 months, we're done. So that would be an example of that. So again, by terms of the instrument that created it, we could grant an easement for a certain period of time, and that would be an example of that. And then we have termination of purpose. To give you an example of termination of purpose, maybe, for example, B granted A an easement to cross over their property to get to a small little man-made fishing pond. And this fishing pond winds up getting backfilled and they build condos there. Well, my purpose of that easement was to go fishing. You know, I can't go fishing anymore because that little pond's not there anymore. So that would be another example of that as well. Then on the next page here on 217, talks about a license. I made mention of that already. And then talks about some restrictions on what you can and cannot do with your property. So again, we do go over restrictions in this chapter. So the first one here is public restrictions. So public restrictions of what you can and cannot do with your property, the easiest way we can describe that is to use the term police power. So police power best describes any public or governmental restrictions on the owner's use of property. So if they were to ask you which of the following would best describe any public or any governmental restrictions on the owner's use of property, we call that police power. So police power, broadly defined, is not just police. It's police, fire, eminent domain, condemnation, escheat, zoning, taxation, building codes. All of those would be included in that. But the general term used to describe any public restrictions on what you can and cannot do with your property is termed a police power. And then we have private restrictions. What privately restricts me from what I can and cannot do on my property? Good example of that's a deed restriction. So if I were to sell my house, and for whatever reason I want to place a deed restriction that says you can't subdivide the property ever, you can't paint it any other color other than white, that's an example of a deed restriction. A form of these, I guess you could say, would be in like a condo community. When I buy in a condo complex, typically, almost always, there's going to be bylaws that tell me what I can and cannot do. I can't paint my exterior, I can't change my roof, I can't redo the siding, I can't change my mailbox, I can't change my driveway, I can't decorate around the holidays, so on and so forth. So just in general, those private restrictions, the most broad way to describe those, we call those deed restrictions. And then towards the bottom right here of 217 talks about encroachment. So an encroachment, for those of you that watch football, is, when the defense crosses the offensive line, they say encroachment on the defense, right? So encroachment is when a piece of a neighboring property crosses your property line. So an encroachment, when a piece of a neighboring property crosses your property line, we deem that to be an encroachment. Well, how do you know if there's an encroachment? Simply put, you'd have a survey done. A survey measures the land. So if I measure the land and I see the neighbor's fence is 2 feet over the property line, that's an encroachment. If I measure the land and I see the neighbor's shed is 2 feet over the property line, that's an encroachment. Now, encroachments don't just end at the ground. Your land technically goes all the way up to the sky and down to the center core of the earth. So even about 100 feet in the air, a neighbor's tree branch cross your property line, that is still deemed to be an encroachment in that situation. So an encroachment is when a piece of a neighboring property crosses your property line. And then on page 218 talks about subsistence. So we have an obligation of what we call lateral and also subjacent support. Lateral support would be like in a townhouse community, right, or in a condo community. You have a shared wall between yourself and your neighbor. Can you do anything to destroy that wall that would basically harm the structural integrity of the structure? No, you can't do that. So you have an obligation of what we call lateral support. So I can't just take a hammer and knock through that wall and say, I want to open up this wall and see my neighbor. No, you can't do that. So you have an obligation what you call lateral support. Subjacent support is when your property sits below somebody. So to draw a quick example up here for that, let's say the property looks something like this. You have this house here, and we have this house here. And that's the property line. This is A, this is B. So in this circumstance here, what winds up happening is A says, you know what, I'd really like to flatten this yard out because I think a flat yard is going to be better and more beneficial. So they start digging away close to the property line right here. Not even on B's property, on A's property, they start digging away because they want to put up a retaining wall. As they do that, they create a sinkhole. When they create this sinkhole, B's property sinks into that sinkhole, and B's structure, foundation, crumbles basically. Even though what I did, property owner A, I did on my property, I'm going to have some liability here because I have an obligation we call subjacent support. I sit below my neighbor at B, and I have an obligation to support them, subjacent support in this case. So that's an example of subsistence when like one property sinks into a sinkhole perhaps. And again, as A, I can't do this because I have an obligation of what we call subjacent support. So that's chapter 7 there. Easements, restrictions, rights of adjoining owners. Quick recap, basically just getting through the main points here. So as always, if you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to email me. My email is kylekovats@gmail.com. Thank you.